We're back with the former Ohio Governor, John Kasich, who recently joined MSNBC as a political contributor. Good to see you again, Governor. Let's talk a little bit about where the Republican Party is going. There are obviously the fears about Donald Trump and his ilk and the anti-democratic stuff that's been going on. But there are a lot of Americans who think the Republican Party is out of touch with American sentiment, particularly in post the fall of Roe v. Wade and some of the remarkably draconian things that have been going on in terms of reproductive health across the country. You were an early player in the restriction of abortion rights in this country, and there are a lot of people who point that out, that they're not sure you're the guy to be telling them about what the Republican Party needs to be in the future.
Well, Al, the only thing I can tell you is when I ran for re-election in Ohio at the time, which was not red, but really purple, I won 86 out of 88 counties. And why is that? I privatized economic development, and we grew 500,000 jobs. I went from a deficit of about $8 billion to leaving, I don't know, $2 or $3 billion in the kitty in a surplus when I left. You have to look at the whole range of things that people do to try to bring people together. I did not, by the way, sign the heartbeat bill here in Ohio. So, it's not just that, but when you go into these areas and you begin to, when you win 86 out of 88 counties, that's unprecedented. So clearly people were happy with what I did. But again, I expanded Medicaid so 600,000 people could get health care. I reformed the health care system. Not only did I cut taxes for people at the top, but I created also significant tax incentives for people who made a lot less money, because I thought when one group rises, they all ought to rise. There's so many issues that we got in the middle of to make government more efficient and more effective.
That's why a whole lot of people said if you were the presidential nominee, there were a lot of Democrats who said they'd vote for you. But abortion has become a much bigger issue in the last year than it was in 2016 because there was federal protection for abortion. Given where we are now and given where Republicans have decided to be in some places on this topic, how do you think about this differently than when you were the governor?
Well, I think, Ali, that the answer here, as one of my friends, pro-lifers, said, why don't we come up with something that's a reasonable compromise on this issue? And, that being around the fact that as people, what is the limit at which you don't want to do that? I mean, you don't want to have abortion in the last trimester. I mean, so there are ways in which I think people, and look, the vote in Kansas really meant a lot, and you have to listen to people. And so I think there are ways to protect, the unborn, but just probably a way to compromise and work your way through that. Let's see. It's in the hands of the states now, and the states can work through.
But you've seen what some of these states are doing, right? I mean, there are literally women who are worried that if something goes wrong in the middle of their pregnancy, they can't get that care. There are doctors who are worried that if you're miscarrying, I can't treat you because I'll get arrested or I'll get. Like, when you say let's see where the states go, it's generally speaking not good.
Some states are going to get it right. And what's most important in all of these states is that women are going to get the kind of great health care they need after they have a baby. It's not enough to just do that and then ignore what happens to the child and what happens to the mother afterwards. Again, the situation in this country is you have 50 states, 50 places where people can make choices. If they make choices that the voters think are too extreme, then they'll be tossed from office. We'll have to see where this all settles down. A lot of issues today that are out there where the public is kind of thinking about, the people are thinking about how they feel, and a lot of these issues will settle down over time, this being one of them.
Fair enough. But what about that 10-year-old rape victim who had to leave Ohio?
Oh, I think that's outrageous. I mean, I think there should be exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother, for sure. I don't agree with that decision.
But you've got a whole bunch of people who are not Trumpians who don't share your view in the Republican Party on this.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a party now that needs to focus on what they can do to provide opportunity for everyone. And so, the Republican Party should be a party that is bringing reform to the kind of things that people want in this country. And that includes, as I said, health care, prescription drugs, immigration, what we're going to do about the rising debt, how we preserve Social Security, how we preserve Medicare. You're not hearing all that. What you're hearing from the loud voices in the Republican Party are attacks on Donald Trump. They're stepping on their own message, and that's why they keep losing elections. And at some point, if they don't change, they're going to continue to lose elections and not win.
Does the language that Donald Trump used last night and when he used at CPAC about I am your retribution How does that sit with you?
Well, how do you think it sits with me, Ali? Why don't you guess? What do you think I think about that?
I mean, look, it triggers alarm in me that I'm not used to. Like it's a whole new level of alarming to me.
Listen,
because you're a Trump enemy, he'll see everybody as an enemy.
First of all, I'm not a Trump enemy. I'm opposed to him. I don't hate anybody. That's not the way it is to be. When I hear that rhetoric, which I've been hearing since 2016, remember, I was the first Republican significant person to fight him. I didn't go to the convention. I even endorsed Joe Biden. So, Ali, you know what I think about that. He's a divider, and the people that support him, many of them are extremely angry. If you listen to them, they feel totally ripped off. And if all you do is encourage that and not give them hope, you end up with people like Donald Trump. And it's very dangerous for where we're going as a country, let alone, I mean, the party is secondary. It's about the country.
Yeah. Governor, good to see you. Good talking to you. Thank you for being with us today. Governor John Kasich, former governor of Ohio, MSNBC political analyst, author of It's Up to Us, 10 Little Ways We Can Bring About Big Change.